Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome once again to another episode of Aagahi with your host, Warisa Zainab. Today we have invited Sister Nazanin, who is a highly specialist cognitive behavioral therapist, and inshallah we'll be addressing a topic that is crucial to discuss, especially in communities like ours, because we in previous episodes have talked about trauma. We've talked about what trauma is and how most of us experience something in life that leaves us traumatized. Now, today we're going to talk about generational trauma. There are so many things that our parents, our ancestors pass on to the next generation. And symptoms of post-traumatic stress is one of those things. So, Sister Nazneen, welcome to Aagahi.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me today.
An honor. So first of all, before we jump into the topic, mashallah, you've been in the field of mental health and psychotherapy for a good 20 years. And the amount of experience you have, mashallah, I'm really excited to hear from you about this topic. So if you could please let our viewers know what generational trauma means.
I think a lot of us do have a good understanding of what trauma is. Trauma is a very distressing event that we go through, that in those events we fear for our own lives or the lives of others, or we are in fear of our own safety. So historically people would go through a period of high level of anxiety, kind of feeling quite hypervigilant. A lot of people would avoid situations or places that reminds them of the trauma, and mostly have reported having intrusions about the incident itself. And what intrusion means is like literally unwanted memories and thoughts about the incident. So trauma usually impacts on how we function. Like if I let's just give you an example. I'm just going to start with something quite less distressing, and I think I need to also say here that sometimes when I give talks like that, it can trigger quite a lot of trauma in other people who have experienced trauma, and sometimes by describing it could not only could validate their experiences, but could also trigger some of those emotions and distress that they have. And I really urge those individuals to look after themselves, first of all, when they're watching this program, and also to be able to take a break if they needed to. But I think it's really important to be responsible for looking after yourself if anything was spoken today that was bringing up any memories. But what would be helpful is to understand it a bit more together. Although I'm not going to be talking about trauma much itself, I'm just going to talk about the impact it has on our families and our offsprings and generation-wise. So if I give a very brief example, like a lot of people who have experienced, let's say, let's just start with a road traffic accident. Like I'd be driving for years and years and suddenly have a really bad road traffic accident where, God forbid, I might be severely injured in this road traffic accident. And historically, some people come out okay, other people may end up in hospitals and coma and that sort of stuff. So obviously this is a traumatic incident, not only for the person who has been through it, but also for people who are hearing it. So thank God I get better and I'm all well and I come out of hospital. Obviously there's some adjustments, if disabilities, some adjustment to the disabilities, but if nothing, just a broken arm, I might come back to the sense of safety. I'm no longer in hospital, I'm back in my bedroom, and then suddenly have these intrusions of the incident, and sometimes feel like I'm back in the car or feel kind of trapped, and let's say, you know, the ambulance are trying to get me out and that sort of stuff. So obviously these are the intrusions that I'm talking about. Of course, a lot of people would avoid going into a car because it would always trigger. Sometimes smell of the petrol, sometimes hearing some of the noises in the traffic could also trigger this. So it could stop here. I could go away and get some, within 7 weeks, a lot of people recover if it's a normal response. However, after that, if these symptoms continue, we advise that people seek help.
Yeah.
And what happens is that, let's say I'm a mother, I've become a mother now, and I have been so distressed about that experience. I've avoided cars, avoided going anywhere near cars, and then I now have my own children.
Yes.
What do you imagine I'd be doing? Do you think I'd be relaxed about my child being in a car? And of course not. And if my child starts growing up and wanting to start driving, do you think I'd be relaxed about them being drivers, or would I even allow them to be drivers? So quite a lot of my anxiety, absolutely. So I would transfer quite a lot of my anxieties to these children, and we know historically a lot of children say, well, I've learned to be anxious because I saw my mom was anxious, or somebody said, oh, I'm very phobic about this because my dad has been phobic about it. So we know fear is a learned experience. So we see it in others, and we learn them. So when we think about generational trauma, imagine all that stuff. We know historically, if we talk about our own ancestors, our own parents, and even the stories we hear about Muharram, for example, the Battle of Karbala itself, so we are known to have histories of traumatic incidents that, like, for example, I come from, historically, my parents and I was born in Iraq, so we have our own trauma that relates to the Ba'ath regime, maybe the imprisonments that some of our families went through. We, as children, experienced bombing. Some people went through war. So of course there are some traumas that we carry with us.
Oh, yes.
So if we were to think about genocides, if we were to think about experiences like there is a traumatic incident of a city, of a nation, and we know the Shiite Muslims in Iraq were constantly prosecuted. So whenever somebody went out, there was not a possibility of them coming back. So of course quite a lot of people were living in a continuous level of stress and trauma. And what happens is that we end up discussing, or we end up actually experiencing our traumas, and sometimes passing it on to our children. Like, as I suggested earlier, because I have anxiety about a car and I've had a car accident, I probably would transfer that anxiety to my child. Equally, if I had experienced, let's say, genocide, and I know there's been a lot of experiences of genocide or family imprisonments, like in Iraq, we have a lot of families who were imprisoned together for months and years. Then we come to a place of safety, then our children live a completely different life. What sometimes happens is that how we talk about these traumas and how we respond as well to these traumas can easily have an impact on our children. Okay, so for example, if I have a sense of, I think that kind of describes what generational trauma is. It's transferred from one generation into another.
So you give a brilliant example of the Iraqi nation who have been through so much, generations after generations, and they have witnessed war, conflict, genocide, torture, imprisonment, and the list goes on. So it's not just your parents or your grandparents. I think it goes back to even back to your great-great-grandparents, right?
Absolutely. Like, for example, I'm a Shiite Kurd.
Yeah.
So historically, we were prosecuted for being Kurds in Iraq, and then equally being prosecuted for being Shiite Muslims. So we know the Kurds in northern Iraq were chemically bombed. So we know that there are historical trauma as well. But something about historical trauma where you go through together as a community, and it lives within the community. But I think the generational traumas that we talk about could be an individual trauma. It could be, as I discussed, it could be the traffic accident. It could be being brought up in a domestic violent environment, having lived a domestic violent relationship, having had childhood atrocities, neglect, having had childhood abuse, going through a period of abuse where my ability to trust others does get impacted. So of course, how many times we've had mothers kind of interfering in girls' choices in marriage or decision making because they have experienced negative marriages.
Yes.
So what I guess I'm not trying to suggest here is that, you know, our experience, our traumas is all comes from our parents. That's not what I'm trying to say. But what I'm trying to say that it's not as simple as it is, and if we don't look after ourselves, we can easily transfer it to others.
Yeah. And I think
Does
it's
that
not
make
just,
sense?
yeah, definitely. And I think it's not just unpleasant memories and experiences that you have personally experienced, or things that are a shared experience by the whole family or the whole nation. As long as we recognize it and resolve it, I think there is hope for the next generation. But if we don't resolve those symptoms, then I think it can even take the shape of phobias or fears, and it can cause serious
Absolutely,
disruptions in your
absolutely.
life. Could you
Yeah.
elaborate on that, please?
I guess what I could actually say, like as a therapist, I had to witness a lot of people's distress and traumas. I've heard a lot of awful stories, and I've witnessed a lot of atrocities. I've spoken to people who have experienced torture, neglect, rape, fire. Like when I worked with Grenfell fire, and people who've experienced awful experiences. And a lot of people often wonder, how do you cope? You
Mm,
know, what's that like for you?
yeah,
We know that people do suffer from secondary traumatization. We know um, a lot of people who hear about trauma, even if they have not experienced it,
yeah,
they can develop symptoms of secondary traumatic stress disorder.
absolutely.
So that's because you witness
Mm,
uh, someone suffering. And sometimes by listening to their stories, you create the story and the narrative in your own mind. And sometimes it becomes your own story.
yeah,
So there's a lot of studies that talks about vicarious traumatization for clinicians, for ambulance, for hospital workers who go through experiences where they hear other people's stories
yes,
and their belief system about safety gets interrupted. So if, for example, when I started working with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse,
mm,
I I recall coming back worrying about the children in my family. So if a cousin was speaking to them in the corner of the garden, I would automatically wonder, you know, what if?
yes,
Because a new idea has been introduced
mm,
to me. For example, let's say a lot of people have talked about domestic violence is something I have worked with for years and years, and people do suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you hear how manipulative some of those partners can be in the relationship, be it the husband, be it the wife,
yeah,
sometimes that impacts on your opinion or your relationship with your partner. So the idea is that we hear something that shatters our previously kind of formed beliefs.
mm,
So I suddenly kind of think that the world is unsafe, all children are going to be abused, or
yeah,
all men are abusers, or all women are manipulators, or you know, so because you hear those stories. So
yeah.
secondary traumatic disorder is something that there's been a lot of studies, and also for us as therapists and for all the clinicians out there. So why do you think during the COVID a lot of people were suffering from trauma? That the nurses were
Yes.
suffering from trauma because they were witnessing someone's going through like death or saying goodbye to their families, and those experiences where kind of shatters their own belief system about their own morbidity and living.
So there are two sides to this. One is either they become more vulnerable or their internal radar becomes more activated. But then on the flip side, you also see people who become really desensitized. And this new term that's being used
Hmm.
these days, being over resilient, that's also not a really good thing because nobody wants to be desensitized to other people's emotions or experiences. So,
Yeah, absolutely. The more you are experiencing the stress,
yeah,
the more your brain is developing the stress hormones, cortisol, the less it becomes responsive. It does get desensitized. And there are studies that has suggested children of traumatized parents have lower level of cortisol.
wow,
Yeah, so there are sort of other studies that kind of supports the idea of generational trauma, because we talk about the epigenetic changes that happens when it's a study of how your behavior and the environment you live in can change the way your genes work and impacts on the traits you have. So quite a lot of animals. So there was one particular animal study which is really interesting. There's very little human studies. There are quite a lot about the impact it has on our relationship, trust, and all that stuff. But there was an interesting animal studies where a group of I think they were mice. I think they were given a threat and then an awful smell, and it showed that their offsprings continuously responded to that smell even though they had not experienced that trauma themselves. So it kind of shapes our genes sometimes, and so it's quite important to be aware of that. But it also psychologically transfers quite a lot of our belief system, threat system to our children. And that, like, when I mean, for me growing up during the Ba'ath regime, where I know quite a lot of the Kurds were deported and I was one of them, quite a lot of my mother's family side had lost a lot of young men because Saddam just took them away. And what happened is that family witnessed their sons being dragged away, and of course until now their graves have not been found, and many Iraqis have similar experiences. I particularly witnessed this in my family, within my cousins and my other families, where the young woman who now is a mother had experienced watching her brother being dragged away by the guards. And historically, she had a lot of trauma about that, nightmares and experiences. So it's quite a lot of anxiety around separation. Growing up, she became a mother herself, and that was very much transferred. If you were to take her child away from her, she would get severe anxiety. And equally, this child grew up, and the mum was so protective and so attached to this child that did not allow this child to have a sense of self. She made decision on everything for this child as a way of trying to protect this child. And then what happens, this child grows, becomes an adult, becomes very emotionally kind of also attached. And now that child has a child, that child has grown to be a man. He has a young girl, for example, and equally goes through the same anxiety around separation. So you can see kind of they do get not only biologically, but it impacts you psychologically, impacts you socially. You may start worrying about your safety unnecessarily. Like, for example, we live in England. Thank God you didn't get prosecuted for your thoughts, beliefs, and opinion. Whereas we get our elders often worry about expressing opinions or challenging the police because it's the police, you can't challenge them because there's and you could see that, and then suddenly we become quite intimidated by authority as well, even though the authority hasn't done anything to us, if that makes sense.
We've been programmed from a very early age, and we mimic our caregivers. So when we see that they are silent about certain things, or a certain authoritative figure has a kind of impact, we mimic the same behavior without even rationalizing why we're showing that behavior. And you gave a classic example, Nazneen, about how the epigenetics, they're focusing a lot on how our genes, our DNA, kind of hold those memories in our bodies of the traumatic experience that even an unborn child has experienced in the mother's womb. So shed some light on that. How, because for our viewers to understand that, what is the possibility of an unborn child experiencing certain things in the mother's womb? And
we know historically, we've been told that if you read Quran, your baby in your womb can hear it. If you're a stressed mother, your baby becomes a stressed child. So we know that there is a lot of that transmissions are happening. I must admit, this is not one of my greatest fields, but I am aware that genetically we become formed, and It doesn't mean our DNA changes here. It's just that the shape of our genes gets impacted on. So the way the genes develop certain proteins, and it's the way you live your life, the way you behave in your life, that can shape how your gene will respond. But what's also important to recognize the psychological impact, as I gave you an example, that children learn from parents. So if a mother responds extremely to a spider, what do you think a child will do? So it becomes a learned behavior. But when we talk about generational trauma, sometimes our parents wanted the stories to remain continuously. And we know with the Holocaust, a lot of people have experienced generational trauma. So sometimes your storytelling has a reason. So your suffering has a reason in order for the story to remain, so it doesn't get lost, so people don't forget about it. So we know, for example, I can talk a lot about my Kurdish culture. There are certain sort of traditions in the new year. There are certain kind of group dances that represent resilience, that represents fight against repression. So whoever I've spoken to often say, oh, the Kurds are such resilient individuals. It's like, I have no choice but to be resilient, because that's what I have been shaped to be. But talking about resilience as well, we don't want to talk about traumas just having a negative effect on us. You touched upon over resilience, but I think the idea that sometimes through trauma, we also change and we become better people, we become stronger people. I've often said, going through atrocities does not just make you feel like negative and unsafe and develop PTSD. In a research I did a few years ago, about every time I visited Iraq, I literally walked into Iraq 3 months after it was freed. So the idea of visiting Iraq was so important for me, because I had left it in such an awful way, where we were dragged out of our properties and thrown into prison and then deported. So it was so important that I would go back to Iraq. What I was amazed by is, and this has been the case many years I've gone back, of how resilient people are. I remember having the funniest times and the best times when the electricity went. And we just all sat in the garden with my cousins that I had not met, and saw them the most cheerful and exciting, and they talk about and joking, and the games that we ended up playing because there was no electricity. I kind of wonder, and every single one of them had witnessed a bombing. Every single one of them had witnessed someone being beheaded, and you kind of wondered, what was that about? So my research was, what is it about people that don't necessarily develop PTSD? So the idea of that we also have positive growth from negative experiences, and that we develop a sense of resilience because we have gone through the worst experiences in our life, but yet we've come out the other side. And I'd like to use the Battle of Karbala as an example, and how everyone says, well, how did the family of the Prophet? And sometimes we see ourselves so distant from the family of the Prophet because they're Ahlul Bayt. How could I ever learn from them or be like them? But this is a very important thing for me as a therapist, has been that when you have, as Viktor Frankl, who's a phenomenologist, suggests, that when you give meanings to your struggles, the struggles ends with dignity. So the idea that our struggles is because of our faith, is because of our religion. And quite a lot of Iraqi prisoners who came out of prison, who survived prison, and we know Nelson Mandela talked about this, where he came out the other side and freed a whole nation, is that when you give meanings to your struggles, I am struggling because I'm a Shiite Muslim. I am struggling because I am the family of the Prophet. I'm struggling because I'm standing against repression. Of course, helps you cope with atrocities and those experiences better. So it kind of helps us to develop the resilience that we talked about earlier, that kind of helps us to be where we are. I would suggest that quite a lot of people who do go into supporting and helping profession, historically they would have probably needed help themselves, or historically they would have gone through negative experiences. So knowing that Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam was only apparently 5 years old, and how he became the fifth Imam. He is the fifth Imam, yeah. And Baqir al-Ulum, he was known for his knowledge. And you would think a 5-year-old who'd seen his father beheaded, and how did he cope? But people say, well, he's Ahl al-Bayt.
Yes.
Fair enough, but not necessarily. But it's also we're learning that with positive outlook and having an aim for your struggles and meanings for your struggles, and also a way to come out of these struggles, which takes us to our next step. What do we do then if
That's a brilliant example that you've given, and I've seen this in real life. One of the most kindest and compassionate people that I've come across in my life, they have been through so much. If you talk about what their experiences have been, some of them have been through really horrific, circumstances in life, like some, they've been abused sexually by their own parents, or neglected as a child, or they've witnessed the most horrific things in life, and they've been mistreated by people whom they trusted
yeah
most.
yeah
But they
and they become
haven't.
the most loving parents. And
Exactly,
yeah
because they learn that whatever happened with me, I'm not going to do the same thing with others. So they build like more, compassion
yeah
towards others, and they understand the struggles other people go through.
yeah
They kind
But I
of.
think what's important to say that not everyone does this intentionally. So I don't want to have this blaming culture here. But I think we are all responsible to improve our own mental well-being, if that makes sense. So if I know I am struggling, rather than transferring, projecting to my children, we've heard a lot of parents say, do you know that makes me anxious? When you're late, it makes me anxious. So can you stop being late? Actually, no. Let them live their own life. And if you're anxious, address your own anxiety. Be able to link your anxiety to your past experiences rather than project it, and kind of differentiate, is this anxiety real? Am I really anxious because my son is in danger because it's 9 o'clock and he hasn't turned up?
Mm,
Or is it really reminds me of my own threat when my brother left and he never came back, for example?
yes,
If that makes sense. So we take responsibility, and the best thing about these changes in our genetics is that we can undo them,
yeah,
and that's why therapy comes in.
definitely. And like you said, and I'm really pleased you mentioned upon this, that sometimes we witness something within your family, or even extended, relatives, or even neighbors or work colleagues, and then you develop some kind of anxiety or fear around it, and you start projecting it. For example, you just gave an example of how somebody who may be preventing their children from living their life to the fullest, or becoming overprotective parents and not allowing the children
Yeah,
to live their potential, is one of the symptoms that we see, like
yeah,
secondary trauma.
yeah. I mean, a lot of people tend to overestimate the threat as well, and sometimes misunderstand their own anxiety, because the physiology of anxiety could trigger memories.
Mm,
And then when the memory comes to our brain, like to our conscious mind, um, we sometimes forget that that's actually been in the past,
yeah,
if that makes sense. And by going through it and reliving it, the brain isn't able to archive that memory. So it stays in the emotional part of the brain, which is the amygdala. So
yes,
through therapy, we help to kind of make the difference between there and now. So whenever I'm feeling anxious because someone's late, but whenever I'm feeling anxious, like, oh, I called my son and he didn't pick up, uh, it's like actually saying, take a step back. You know, this isn't your father who never came home. This isn't your brother who was taken by the Iraqi guards, for example. And I know I've seen this in a lot of my extended families and my kind of community. Um, so it's important to, as I said, to take that responsibility and kind of address your own anxiety.
definitely, definitely. And when you've have like generations over generations who have been through a series of traumatic events, not just one traumatic incident, but like a series of events, people sometimes, I've seen, they develop complex PTSD. And then certain cultures don't really consider going for therapy or counseling. and it's just left untreated. So I would like
Absolutely.
you to kind of brush upon that.
And that's how you transfer it, because we can, like, let's say my mom was traumatized, I am traumatized. Let me not transfer it to my child. Let me stop the cycle, if that makes sense, because we know it's generational.
Yes.
So the idea of, you know, what was your question? How do I
So,
help someone
you know, in
in
many
therapy?
cultures, I mean, I know in the Asian culture, and I'm sure in the Arab culture as well, um, going to therapy after experiencing something is not the first thought that comes to people's mind. Often in
Yeah,
many societies, and especially in the Muslim community, people are like, oh, you know, you've got your faith, so you don't really need
yeah,
to go for therapy. It's not required. Just pray, just make dua,
yeah.
read the Quran, and that should on its own be enough to heal.
And of course, quite a lot of us do read the ayahs, and it does help us. We know Imam Sajjad alayhi salam has an incredible dua in Sahif al-Sajjadiyya, dua number 7, which I advise everyone to read. I personally read that. But that doesn't mean that if I am struggling from depression, which has biological symptoms as well as psychological, if I'm suffering from trauma, which, as I said to you, has biological symptoms, you know, your cortisol level gets interrupted and no longer produces cortisol. So, and the effect that has on your muscles, and you end up having fibromyalgia, and you know, that the level of stress you're in, the intensity of those continuous tense muscles. So it's important to, of course, we do need to rely on dua, but equally, if I had a kidney failure, do I just rely on dua, do you think?
No,
Of
definitely.
course, I will go in and reach out and speak to specialists about it. And equally do my dua and prayers and ziyarat that helps me to cope with this. So the idea is that God has given us privileges. You know, for example, we have free NHS. We're very lucky in comparison to other people. So that's a rizq. That's a godsend. You know, we're very lucky, and there's that we have this opportunity. So let's seek out these supports that's available. Let's talk to specialists that could support us. So people think I just go to a therapist and just talk. Well,
Mm,
I can talk to my sister. That's not the case, because if talking is all I did, I'd probably lose my energy, if I'm honest with you. But we are trained
yeah.
to give you tools to help you make a link between your feelings, between your behaviors, between your thoughts. And earlier I said that our genes kind of changes based on the environment and the behaviors that
Yes.
we engage in. So let's not impact that, because it impacts on our health as well.
Yes, definitely.
We know the level of stress impacts on diabetes, the level of stress and the hormones, and the sugar level gets impacted, high blood pressure. We know a lot of people who have developed heart condition because of stress. So there's clearly biological response to psychological distress. So it's not a joke, you know, you've got to do something about it. If you're constantly in high level of anxiety, that is a concern. You'll have physical health consequences afterwards.
Definitely.
So when you come to speak to a therapist, quite a lot of the therapists, you know, are trained in providing culturally sensitive psychotherapy.
Yes.
We are very lucky to live in a country that people like myself has been given the opportunity to be supervisors who makes an impact on working with people who don't have an understanding of the Muslim culture. Then suddenly I do give consultations. So every NHS you go into, there is somebody from a different community. So and within the NHS, and as supervisors ourselves, we often are in continuous training of ourselves and our staff. So when you go and speak to a therapist,
Yeah.
you actually get a chance to understand.
So Nasin, you mentioned about some of the symptoms of generational trauma, for example, hypervigilance and avoidance and all of that. But say, for example, if someone who is experiencing it but is completely unaware of the symptoms, what should people look out for to recognize if they are experiencing any
I
symptoms of
think
PTSD?
with sort of generational trauma, it's important to recognize that I'm struggling with, based on what your trauma is really.
Mm,
If it's been relational, if it's been safety, depends on what the type of traumas you've had. Do I struggle with trust? Am
Yeah.
I often questioning people's genuinity? And do I present with anger, frustrations, and or irritability? We've seen a lot of people who have experienced, like they've been to militaries, they often struggle to keep relationship going. There's a lot of anger, irritability. It's important to recognize through the repressions I lived
Yes.
in my experiences, am I struggling with low self-esteem? Is this what I'm also transferring to my children, where I'm not supporting them to develop a stronger self-esteem? Of course, anxiety is a theme in any form of trauma, depression, how I see myself, how I see the world, how I see relationships in general, my view of self, often it's negative, which kind of leads into us feeling quite depressed.
Yes.
Um, um, do I have this unreasonable fear and this constant worry about people dying and injury? Am I always thinking about the worst case scenario? And do I always predict negativity that, if someone's late, they're probably dead. If someone's late, they're probably hurt in a car accident. Am I constantly predicting negativity? Of course, we know a lot of people use substances to manage some of those emotions. We know people use drugs and some use alcohol. So it's really important to recognize, am I using it to kind of numb my emotions and feelings? We talked to
I'm glad you mentioned addictions, because trauma and addictions are like so,
they go hand in
yeah,
hand. Absolutely,
definitely.
absolutely,
And it's
absolutely.
not only use of certain substances, but we also see people who have experienced generational trauma. They become workaholics. They find it difficult to maintain healthy relationships. So there are so many things.
Sometimes commitment becomes an issue, of course, in any form or shape, whether it's relationship, whether it's a job, whether it's a university.
Mm,
Um, we know people over prescribe, when
yes,
it's unnecessary, they take certain medication. A lot of people know where they're generous and share each other's medications. I think these are the ways that it tends to show itself as well.
yeah,
Of course, social withdrawal, avoidance to be around people, and these are normal symptoms for people with mental health issues.
yes, definitely.
And I would say, I guess you would know that because of my past traumas, I now have problems around uncertainty.
Mm,
Well, if I didn't have those experiences, I'll probably be able to cope with the unknown.
yes,
Um, we've had a lot of people who don't want to watch the news, and they kind of, oh no, just don't put it on the news. Or we've heard a lot of people kind of say, oh, don't talk about the subject. Kind of lots of avoidance as
oh
well.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, definitely. I've had experiences in families where they're watching a movie where it's to do with shooting, and then suddenly
Mm,
the parents become so angry because they've had a trigger themselves. And I think these are the transferences. These are the stuff that we transfer to our own children. Suddenly shooting becomes my issue when I've not experienced it, if that makes sense.
you
Um,
mentioned irritability. What about anger and guilt?
I mean, with trauma, we often treat anger and we often work with guilt. So quite a lot of people with survivor's guilt,
Mm,
quite a lot of people who, experience trauma where others died, especially when I worked with victims of torture in the Iraqi prison. A lot
wow,
of people was like, my inmate died, and sometimes they would choose between us, and sometimes I'm asked to make that choice, so and also we know with the Grenfell Tower, God knows, like, a lot of people experience the survivor's guilt because the next door neighbor didn't survive, or their father didn't survive. So we know guilt is a theme. Shame also is a theme, depends on what your experience is. So yeah, it's important to be aware that these are the side effects. So we need to go out there and get some help. I personally, throughout the years I have worked with trauma,
mm,
I have seen people from West to get better, and I've seen girls who've managed to get married and have children who were abused in prison for 5 years, raped and tortured, but
wow,
managed to kind of develop their own families. I have worked with um, people from back in Africa where they have experienced genocide, where they've never been able to sleep in a certain position because of it was a reminder, and now they're able to kind of move on with their lives and do things. People do recover from their traumas. I certainly have worked with people who didn't go into the trains because of the train crashes that they were involved in. I treated a lot of people in the Grenfell Tower where every time there was a smell of fire, it would take them back to that. But now they're able to say, that's my memory. I no longer have, because it's all to do with processing.
Mm.
Because what has happened, all these traumatic experiences you've had, your brain has not been able to process and archive it. And that's how our brain functions. It needs to process information. And then we have these boxes in our head that
Mm.
says, oh, it goes to this box and then it goes to this box. But when we're traumatized, it's just a lot of information, high level of cortisol, shutdown of the frontal lobe, unable to make sense of these experiences. So they go into the emotional part of the brain. So they're sat there. And every time they want to be processed, they come in as an intrusion and we push it away because we just don't want to deal with it. And we avoid going to places that reminds us. So the brain says, I'm overloaded. Please talk about me. And
Even
that's how therapy could support.
even being a witness to someone else experiencing something traumatic could be pretty intense in terms of dealing with one's own emotions in the long run.
Absolutely. Like there's a lot of group supports for people. So definitely. And what I could say is that your life will change when you speak to someone where you have a different view. Because sometimes we live in our experiences like this, we're kind of inside the experience, but therapy kind of takes you out and kind of says to you, this is your experience, let's look at it together. So kind of by pulling you out, you have a helicopter view of your experiences. And we know that the more you talk about your thoughts,
Mm.
the less intense, the less important, the less scary they become.
So
So it's like an
Nancy,
inflated balloon.
you are a cognitive behavioral therapist, and CBT is known to be pretty effective for PTSD. Um, Tell us more about what is the best treatment intervention, what forms of therapy, or what other interventions could be really, really helpful in dealing with these symptoms.
Well, I mean, talking therapies, depending on what your goal is, of course. We've got narrative therapy, where you're able to kind of narrate your story with a therapist. There's a process of doing it. There is an EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, but they're able to do the eye movement desensitization by bringing up the memory and kind of doing some eye movement around that supports with the processing. We also know that there are relational kind of therapies if I'm struggling with relationship issues. Sometimes I just need the space to reflect, so I can easily just speak to a counselor. There's so many different specialities. However, within the NHS, a lot of funding has been put into training quite a lot of the therapists that are already psychologists and therapists in cognitive behavior therapy because it's effective, it works quickly, and it also maintains the changes that we have. Sometimes long-term psychotherapy can be a space for you that just kind of understand yourself. I often say, go and get to know yourself, go and date yourself, and try and see and find out what you like, what you dislike, what impacts you, what makes you happy, what makes you sad.
What about children, Nazneen? I mean, I know adults can go for therapies and counseling, but what about children who are under the age of 10?
Of course, we do have adult psychology and we have children's services as well that offer psychology. So with adults, you go to normal adult services, but with children, you go to children's services. Of course, GP can always make referral to support with that referral. Children can go through so many different types of therapy. They can also have EMDR, they can also have narrative, they can also have CBT. Equally, they can have art therapy. So, it's really important to intervene with children because we don't want those genes to shape itself. We want to kind of make those changes earlier
Of
in
course.
their lives. And of course, it allows the children to understand themselves better.
Mm.
With children, with adults, we have a better understanding. We can make sense of the world better. With children, they really struggle to make sense of the world. So, and they end up blaming themselves for everything, really. So it's really helpful to kind of give them that opportunity to explore what's bothering them, what's making them unhappy. Children often show their distress in in problematic behaviors, in bedwetting, in a lot of anger. So it would be really helpful to kind of give them the room to kind of understand what's going on with them. So definitely you can speak to a GP, you can make a referral to called CAMS, Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services. With general adults, you can go online and look for your local improving access to psychological therapies, and you can self-refer yourself. Within 2 weeks, somebody contacts you and does a quick assessment of what your difficulties could be.
Thank you
And
so
then they
much,
can, of course.
Jazakumullah khairan for all the information that you shared with our viewers today and helping us get a better understanding of generational trauma. Any
My pleasure.
final words of wisdom you would like to share?
If you need to get closer to God, and if you need to understand God, you need to understand yourself. So man arafa nafsah, arafa rabbah. So that's all I can say.
Beautiful.
So whoever knows self knows God. So reflection therapy could give you the space for your spirituality and stop being wrapped up with anxieties and distress. That gives you more room for spirituality. So do seek help.
Jazakumullah khairan for that.
Thank
And
you
to
so much.
all our lovely viewers, if you have any questions to ask Sister Nazneen, then please contact our studio number. We'll be more than happy to connect you with her. We're always looking for feedback and any comments that you would like to share with us about today's episode or any other episode on a specific topic that you would like us to share. Please use our Facebook or YouTube page to share your comments and feedback. Until next Saturday, we will inshallah see you again with another guest and another topic around your mental health. Till then, look after yourselves. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.